It was a bright, sunny afternoon, and the sunlight poured through the tall glass windows of JFK International Airport. The airport was buzzing with people from all over the world, each in their own rush. Rihanna walked through the terminal, her oversized sunglasses hiding most of her face, but her presence was unmistakable. She wore a casual yet stylish outfit that matched her easy confidence. Even though she was one of the most famous people on the planet, she liked to travel quietly, with just a few people around her. No huge group, no fuss. She preferred to blend in. But today, things were different. As Rihanna walked closer to the check-in counter, she could feel the eyes on her. The crowd behind her seemed to grow bigger, whispers spreading through the air. Some recognized her immediately, while others just couldn't help but be drawn to her strong, confident energy. A man in a sharp suit standing behind her in line watched closely as she approached the desk. His expression tightened as if he were annoyed by her presence. When Rihanna finally reached the counter, she flashed a friendly smile at the young woman behind it, whose name was Clara. But before Clara could speak, the man behind Rihanna cleared his throat loudly, breaking the moment. "Excuse me, but some of us are in a hurry," the man said, his voice sharp and full of annoyance. "Is there a special line for people who think they're more important than everyone else?" The crowd fell quiet, and Rihanna, unfazed, turned to face him. Her sunglasses slid down just enough to show her focused, unblinking gaze. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice calm but firm. "Was there something you wanted to say to me directly?" The man behind Rihanna didn't hide his frustration. His face twisted into a sneer as he watched her, clearly not happy about the situation. As Rihanna stood at the counter, Clara, the young employee, tried to stay calm, but the tension in the air was thick. The man couldn't hold back anymore. "Excuse me," he said loudly, glaring at Rihanna. "Some of us have places to be. Is there a special line for people like you?" His voice was dripping with judgment, and everyone in line could hear it. Clara froze, unsure of what to do. She glanced nervously at Rihanna, who was still standing tall, unfazed. Rihanna's calm expression didn't change as she turned around slowly to face him. The man's words hung in the air, and the crowd around them started to notice. People began to whisper, some recognizing Rihanna, others just curious about the sudden tension. Rihanna's sunglasses slid down her nose just a little, giving the man a clear look at her intense, focused eyes. She didn't look angry, but there was no mistaking that she wasn't going to back down. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice steady but firm. "Was there something you wanted to say to me directly?" The man let out a short laugh, clearly not bothered by her calmness. "Look," he sneered, "I don't care who you are. People like you always think you can get ahead because of your fame. But there are others here who've earned their place." His words were sharp, and the crowd grew even quieter, their eyes bouncing between Rihanna and the man. Rihanna's eyes narrowed slightly, but her voice remained even, like steel wrapped in velvet. "I'm sorry, but last I checked, I'm in the same line as you. Unless you're implying something else?" The man's face turned red. He wasn't about to back down now. "You people always play the victim," he muttered, eyes burning with anger. "Just because you've got fame doesn't mean you can flaunt it everywhere." The crowd reacted with low murmurs of disapproval, some even stepping closer as if to stand with Rihanna. A young woman nearby, who had been quietly observing the exchange, finally spoke up. "Sir, maybe you should mind your own business and stop judging others. Not everything is as you see it." Her voice was strong, and it made the man's face turn an even darker shade of red. Before the man could respond, a loud voice interrupted the tension. "What's going on here?" A security officer walked up, his tall frame cutting through the crowd. He glanced between the man, Rihanna, and Clara, who was still behind the desk, unsure how to react. The officer's badge read Officer Blake, and he was calm but clearly in charge. The tension in the air grew thick as Officer Blake looked from the man to Rihanna, then back to Clara, who was still standing behind the counter. The crowd watched, waiting to see what would happen next. Officer Blake was tall and imposing, his presence instantly making people straighten up. He didn't look pleased, and the man's angry muttering didn't seem to impress him at all. Rihanna, still calm, spoke first. "I'm fine," she said, her voice steady. I can handle this. But even though her words were calm, a small flicker of tiredness crossed her face. These kinds of situations weren't new for her. The man wasn't backing down. She's causing a scene, he said loudly. She probably thinks she can do whatever she wants just because she's famous. This place is a mess because of her. His voice was full of frustration, and the people around them couldn't believe what they were hearing. Officer Blake raised an eyebrow. He didn't seem impressed by the man's rant. Did you do anything to provoke this? He asked the man, his tone even but firm. Rihanna shook her head. Not unless standing in line counts as provoking someone, she said, her voice calm but sharp. The man opened his mouth to respond, but Officer Blake didn't give him the chance. Sir, Officer Blake said, his voice growing colder, I suggest you calm down. This kind of behavior won't be tolerated here. The man muttered something under his breath, but Officer Blake wasn't having it. It's time you move to the back of the line, Officer Blake continued, his voice leaving no room for argument. Let's see how you handle waiting like everyone else. The crowd around them let out a collective murmur of approval. Some of the passengers who had been watching closely even gave small nods, silently agreeing with the officer. The man's face turned crimson as he stomped away, clearly embarrassed and angry. Rihanna turned back to Clara, giving her a soft, reassuring smile. Sorry about that, Rihanna said quietly. Clara blinked, still a little in shock, but managed to smile back. Thank you for handling that so well, she said, her voice steadier now. Rihanna's smile widened just a little. It's not your fault, she replied, the kindness in her voice still shining through. After the scene had died down, Rihanna finished checking in. She gave Clara a small nod, as if to let her know everything was okay. Clara smiled back, clearly relieved. Rihanna walked away from the counter, her thoughts still lingering on the confrontation. The crowd had started to move again, but whispers followed her, some full of curiosity, others filled with admiration. Rihanna had dealt with the situation with grace, but inside, she felt the weight of it. She didn't let it show, though. As she walked toward her gate, she put her sunglasses back on. The bright sunlight reflected off the glass, making everything seem a little blurrier, a little farther away. It was a shield of sorts, one she used often when the world became too loud. Rihanna found a seat in a quieter corner near the gate. Even though the airport was crowded, her presence still seemed to command attention. People looked her way, some trying to sneak a glance, others daring to approach. A couple of fans walked up, shy but hopeful, asking for selfies. Rihanna smiled warmly at them, taking a few photos and chatting for a brief moment. She didn't mind it. If anything, it helped her feel a bit lighter. But still, her mind kept drifting back to the man at the counter. She tried to push the thoughts away. She was about to board a flight, after all, another moment, another city, another chance to escape the noise. But the encounter stayed with her. It wasn't the first time she had faced something like that, and it wouldn't be the last. The gate agent's voice suddenly broke through her thoughts. Now boarding for first-class passengers, she announced. Rihanna stood up, smoothing her clothes, blending into the group of other first-class passengers. She handed her ticket to the agent and made her way down the jet bridge. As she did, her eyes scanned the crowd and she noticed him. The same man from the counter. He was standing off to the side, still glaring at her, his face full of anger. Rihanna chose to ignore him. She had already said everything she needed to. Rihanna had barely settled into her first-class seat when the calm of the cabin was shattered. Passengers were still boarding, some chatting, others finding their seats. But then, just as the last group of economy passengers began to enter, a loud commotion erupted from the back of the plane. Raised voices echoed through the aisles, and it wasn't long before a flight attendant appeared in first class, looking visibly stressed. "Miss Rihanna," she said hesitantly, her voice filled with nervousness. "I'm sorry to bother you, but there's a problem in the economy cabin, and your name came up." Rihanna raised an eyebrow, surprised. "My name?" she repeated, unsure of what to expect. The flight attendant nodded. "Yes. The man from earlier, the one who caused trouble at the check-in counter? He's refusing to sit down. He's saying you're getting special treatment, and now he's causing a scene." Rihanna's calm expression didn't falter. She took a slow breath and stood up, her heels clicking lightly against the floor as she made her way down the aisle. All eyes were on her. As she walked toward the back of the plane, a hush fell over the cabin. The whispers from the passengers in first class followed her, some of them clearly curious, others a little uncomfortable. When Rihanna reached the economy section, she saw him immediately. The man from earlier was standing, red-faced, arguing with a flight attendant. His voice was loud and angry, and several people around him looked annoyed. Some were filming the scene on their phones, capturing every moment. Rihanna didn't hesitate. She stepped forward and addressed the man. "Excuse me," she said, her voice cutting through the noise. The man turned, his eyes locking onto hers, and his face twisted in annoyance. "Well, well, here she comes," he sneered. Queen herself, too good to follow the rules. Rihanna crossed her arms, her tone calm but strong. "I don't know what your problem is," she began, "but this behavior isn't going to get you anywhere. Do you really want to ruin the flight for everyone else just because of your assumptions about me?" The man scoffed. "You celebrities think you're better than everyone else," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "You get all the special treatment, while the rest of us have to deal with less." Rihanna didn't flinch. "I paid for my seat, just like everyone else here," she said, her voice firm but controlled. "The difference between us isn't where we sit, but how we treat people." She paused for a moment, looking around at the other passengers. "Look around," she said quietly. "Do you see anyone agreeing with you?" The man glanced around, his face reddening as more and more people shook their heads or shot him disapproving looks. His confidence began to crumble, and Rihanna could see it in his eyes. "Maybe," she said with a small sigh, "you should stop judging people and start reflecting on yourself. Now, sit down and let's all enjoy the rest of this flight." The passengers around them erupted in applause. Some cheered, others clapped. Rihanna didn't say another word. She turned to the flight attendants who were watching the scene with wide eyes. "Everything good now?" she asked, her tone soft. The lead flight attendant nodded, a look of relief on her face. "Yes, Miss Rihanna. Thank you. That was amazing." As the flight continued, the tension in the air started to fade. Rihanna returned to her seat in first class, settling in with a sigh. The applause had barely stopped, but inside, she was exhausted. She had handled the situation with grace, but it had taken a toll. The man from earlier had gotten what he deserved, but the whole ordeal wasn't something she could just brush off. Rihanna put on her headphones, the soft music helping to calm her mind. Her thoughts drifted, as they often did when she needed to escape. She thought about the passengers who had been on her side, how they had quietly supported her. Then her mind wandered to the man. Was he really as angry as he seemed, or was he just fighting to protect an image of himself that he thought was important? Either way, the confrontation had been necessary. It wasn't just about her. It was about standing up for what was right, for treating everyone with respect. As the plane began its descent, Rihanna's phone buzzed. A few notifications from social media had popped up, people commenting on the viral video from earlier. Some messages were supportive, praising her for handling the situation so calmly. Others were critical, but she didn't let that bother her. People would always have their opinions, and she knew that no matter what. When the plane finally landed, Rihanna was one of the first to disembark. Her usual poise and elegance were in full force, even though she felt drained. She moved through the airport quickly, trying to block out the noise and flashing lights. The paparazzi were always there, ready to snap photos, but today she didn't have the energy to care about them. As she was heading toward her car, a young man, probably in his late 20s, approached her. She recognized him as one of the passengers from her flight. He had been recording the incident earlier. He looked a little nervous, but stepped forward, clearly wanting to say something. "Miss Rihanna," he said, catching his breath. "I just wanted to say thank you. My little sister was on that flight, and seeing you stand up to that man meant a lot to her. It's not every day someone like you speaks up." Rihanna stopped, the tiredness from the day melting away just a little. She smiled at him, her eyes softening. "Tell your sister she's stronger than she knows," she said warmly. "And remind her that no one gets to define her worth." The man nodded, grateful. As Rihanna got into her car and the door closed behind her, she looked out the window, watching the city pass by. The day had been long, and the events had left their mark on her, but in that moment, she felt a small sense of peace. It wasn't about the attention, the videos, or even the drama. It was about standing up for herself and for others who couldn't always do the same. The car sped off, but for Rihanna, the feeling of making a difference lingered. After the car pulled away, Rihanna sat back, her gaze lost in the city skyline. The day had been a whirlwind, full of emotions, unexpected tension, and moments that tested her patience. She was exhausted, but there was something about the peaceful drive that gave her a chance to breathe. The world outside seemed to move so quickly, but inside the car, everything felt slower, calmer. She thought about the flight and what had happened earlier, the man at the check-in counter, the argument on the plane, the way she'd stood her ground. The whole ordeal had left a mark on her, but it wasn't just the negative parts she remembered. What stood out more was how the passengers had rallied behind her, how they had shown support without saying a word. That made her feel proud. Rihanna had always known that standing up for what's right wasn't easy, but today had reminded her of something important. It wasn't about getting the last word or winning the argument. It was about having the courage to speak up when you see something wrong, even when it feels uncomfortable. That was the true power. Her phone buzzed again. More messages. Some were from friends, others from fans, all sharing the video of what happened. The video had gone viral in minutes, and the opinions were pouring in. Most of them were positive, congratulating her for handling the situation with such grace. A few were critical, but Rihanna had long since learned to ignore negativity. People would always talk, but it wasn't about them. The car turned onto a quiet street, and Rihanna's thoughts shifted. She thought about the young man she had met on the flight, the one who had thanked her for standing up to the man. His words stuck with her. "It meant a lot to my little sister," he had said. Rihanna knew that making a difference in one person's life, helping them feel seen, heard, and empowered, was more important than any headline. She hoped his sister would remember the courage she had shown, and maybe one day she would do the same for someone else. As the car continued its journey, Rihanna leaned her head against the window, watching the lights of the city twinkle in the distance. She didn't need the fame or the applause. What mattered to her was using her voice to make the world a better place, one small moment at a time. Sometimes it only took a few words, a little bravery, and a willingness to be yourself in the face of judgment. She knew she couldn't change everything in one day, but she could do her part. And today, that felt like enough.